Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining me today at the Perl and Raku conference. This is Rescue and Renew, How to Get Legacy Open Source Projects Unstuck. And my name is Sumana Harihareswara, and I am a project manager in New York City. Specifically, I run ChangeSet Consulting, where I focus on short-term targeted project management services for free and open source software projects and the organizations that depend on them. So in my talk today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the, legacy software, really. That's primarily what I'm going to be talking about, because most of my work has been with legacy software. I worked at the Wikimedia Foundation with Python, with Autoconf, and so I think of legacy as strangers depend on it enough that you have to be careful when changing it. And so today I'll be talking about how to get a legacy open source software project unstuck. Let me share with you the overview that you'll be seeing today, and this is I'll start with who I am and who you are. I'll move on to talking about some stories of WisCon, Autoconf, and Pipenv, 3 case studies. I'll talk about how projects get stuck and unstuck, and I'll ask you to join me. So let me just see if there's... Nope, okay. I see that Chrome has changed how it displays PDFs since the last time that I tested. So I hope this is okay, and please speak up in the textual chat if there's something wrong with the view here and the screen size and the stuff like that of my slides. So first, as I mentioned, I'm a project manager, I'm a teacher, I'm a consultant, and I also sort of feel like Frodo a little bit in The Lord of the Rings. This is not going to be the kind of talk where you need to have an in-depth knowledge of all of Tolkien in order to understand it. But there's this bit early on where a bunch of people are trying to figure out how are we going to get this really important thing accomplished. It's very hard. And Frodo steps up and says, "I will take the ring, though I do not know the way." And I always assume, like, this seems to me like something he says maybe with a lot of frustration in his voice, like, "I will take the ring, though I do not know the way." This is something I will step up because somebody needs to. I have seen the problem and nobody else seems to be stepping up. I call this damn it driven leadership, as in, damn it, someone's got to do this. And this is me and this is you, honestly. Like, this is a fair amount of the things that I've done in life that could be called leadership were like this, right? And maybe you're in the situation as well where you depend on scores of open source applications, frameworks, and libraries, and maybe one hasn't released for years. There's stuff in the trunk, right? People are developing it, but there hasn't been a release, or there's another one that's struggling with a big rewrite or a difficult maintainer. And maybe you want to get one of those projects unstuck, expedite a release, or deal with a team member that everybody else is having trouble with, something else, right? There's a problem, no one else is stepping up. You're not the expert, you're not already one of the maintainers of that project, but someone needs to step up if this problem is going to be solved. And in open source, when the right experts have a chance to work with legacy projects, we can refresh their digital, social, if necessary, financial and legal infrastructure so that they can thrive. And through my consulting business, I've helped get GNU Autoconf, the Python package index, and various other open source projects unstuck over the last few years, and I'll share some stories of those successes. And one of them only took about 15 hours of work. So today I'll talk about the 5 major places that open source projects get stuck and how to address each. And my hope is you'll come away from this talk with some steps you can take to rescue and renew open source projects, regardless of language, framework, or platform. If one of you could possibly say a thing such as hello in the Zoom chat, that would help me a little bit with that feeling of, well, I'm giving a live talk and there's humans here, but I don't get to hear or from any of you. Thank you for saying hi. I appreciate it. So, I'm sorry for my desperate and constant need for validation. That's probably not going away, but I'll apologize anyway. So first, people are saying hi. Thank you so much. So next up, I'm going to tell a few stories, right? Again, you do not need to be some kind of Tolkien person in order to appreciate this talk. This is not going to be like, I'm not going to give you like 10 paragraphs about trees or something. Nothing against trees, nothing against trees. First, let's talk about WisCon. So this is a time when I really helped by gathering information and helping people make decisions, honestly, mostly by unifying the to-do list. In 2011, I had already been a project manager in proprietary software and some in open source. And I was also a participant in a really lovely feminist sci-fi fantasy conference called WisCon that happens every May in Madison, Wisconsin. And the volunteers who develop a web application to manage WisCon had just a jumble of bug reports and feature requests in Basecamp, Google Code, old emails, and text notes. And one year they had a session at the convention that said, hey, we need help. We need some help with project management and just getting everything consolidated. So over the course of about 3 or 4 months in 2011, I consolidated and organized all of those to-dos into a prioritized queue. I put all the code-related issues into Google Code, and I kept the team on one page, like on the same page, via Basecamp updates and a weekly conference call. So by the end of it, people were much more aligned about, okay, here's what needs to happen, here's what's next. So let me share a couple of lessons that I learned from that experience. One is when you're doing something like this, you can make a big, big difference just by doing what I think of as like opening up all the drawers and looking under the couch. Look for where people are actually stashing notes, things to do, branches, and so on and so on. And don't get distracted by should. Don't get distracted by the idea that, well, everybody should be putting it here. No, there were people who literally had things saved as, emails that had been sent to them at some point that they knew ought to go into the main developer documentation, but they weren't there yet, right? So be willing to do the kind of tedious work of gathering all that information, consolidating it, and synthesizing it and putting it in the right place to make a big difference. My second lesson is, look, did I love Google Code at the time? No, but it was what the people who were actually contributing most were using / wanted to use out of all these different platforms that people had done a little bit here and a little bit there. So in my opinion, try to pick whatever the most people who are actually doing work right now want to use and consolidate on that if you have an issue where you need to kind of unify a bunch of stuff. And last, you don't have to be a lead developer to pick up certain prioritize and triage and file tasks. And in fact, it can be better if you're not, because if at least one of the maintainers of the project or one of the leaders or someone who's helping out in a managerial coordinated capacity is not actually that enthusiastic about programming, that can be incredibly helpful. I mean, look, I can program, but programming is not the primary thing I feel enthusiastic about in group software projects. So when I see a bug that needs fixing, I'm not really tempted into doing that, which would draw me away from the project management work. Instead, when I see a thing that looks like, a really well-defined bug that needs fixing or a feature that needs implementing, I delegate it. I think about how to prioritize it. I think about who could do that work and what processes and relationships are needed to support them. And I think people who mostly want to write software can lose focus on the big picture of project success, which is why it's helpful to have people with complementary interests running a project together. That's the WisCon story. Next, let's talk about Autoconf. So just briefly, this is a story about gathering funding in some way. And so it's about like when you're paying people for the first time, we've been talking about this for quite some time in open source software, and there's a 2005 article by Benjamin Mako-Hill called Problems and Strategies in Financing Voluntary Free Software Projects. So there's I will also be directing you to some other stuff that I wrote about grants and how to get them. I've written about this, and that is all on the page of past talks that I've given. But today I want to talk primarily about getting corporate funding. And the thing that I'm going to talk about is Autoconf. I'm pasting a link in the Zoom chat to the sort of case study that I wrote for the LWN, Linux Weekly News magazine, about what we did for Autoconf. But just to give you some background for those of us who perhaps don't do that much with C and C++ and similar languages on the command line, GNU Autoconf is a tool for producing configure scripts for building, installing, and packaging software on POSIX systems such as Linux. It's a core component of the GNU build system, also known as Auto Tools. When a user installs a software package on the command line, by compiling it from source, they're often instructed to run /configure make install, and Autoconf is what creates that configure script, the thing that's called configure in the very beginning of that. It was founded in 1991, and it had releases going on at a pretty steady clip up until 2012. On April 24th, 2012, there was a release of Autoconf 2.69. And then there weren't any releases for years, even though contributors were still contributing patches and maintainers were still merging them. But just no one had time to put out a new release. And in January 2020, Keith Bostick sent this email to the public Autoconf mailing list saying, is there someone we could pay to do a new release of the Autoconf toolset? So I have a friend named Zach who contributes to Autoconf, and he saw this and contacted me, and we decided that he and I, Change Set Consulting being me and then him being a subcontractor, would say, hey, Keith, maybe we could be that person, right? So in February, we sent him an email and started talking about a first engagement and discussed a discovery phase. Like, all right, let's figure out what all the things are that need doing. And so we got some money from Keith to do that. And so we wrote a giant to-do list. You see where the scroll bar is here and how there's a lot more underneath it. So we wrote this, all right, if we were going to really do everything to make this a really robust ongoing project, there are some things. And so then we talked with Keith and were able to get some money from him and some from Bloomberg and some from the GNU the GNU Toolchain Fund at the Free Software Foundation. All together in order to do a subset of this. And it took a long time. It took longer than we thought it would. This is a picture from Star Trek: The Next Generation episode where an engineer, a scientist, is saying, well, that's true, but I'm sure it's the last real problem. And we ran into that a lot. Let me talk a little bit about what happened there. Well, I mean, we did finally, Zach released the Autoconf 2.70 version as of December 2020, later than we thought we would. But it's out, right? But it took so long. It took longer than we thought it would. So let me talk about some lessons about what worked and thoughts on how to get more of this. Look for people who are already offering. Look for people who are already credible contributors or who maybe have already even said, hey, is there someone I can pay to do a thing that everyone wants done, right? Not just a custom feature for them, but something like, a migration or a release that everybody really wants to have happen. There may be people who have already sort of raised their hands and said, could I pay for this? Second, really watch out for fixed price engagements, right? Zach and I got a certain amount of money from this set of donors, and then it was a big time suck. Preparation for the Autoconf 2.70 release, Zach has said, took almost twice as long as anticipated. He made 5 beta releases between July and December 2020, and he merged 157 patches, most of them bug fixes. And part of this is, if you don't already have continuous integration in place, then finding and fixing regressions can be not just a time suck, but this unknown time suck, right? If you don't have automated, which Autoconf did not have, right? There are automated tests, but it was not set up so that a patch automatically failed until it and the trunk with that patch merged would pass those automated tests. So it would have been nice to have that ahead of time. And if you don't have it, you got to be really careful about the estimates that you make. Now I want to talk about Pipenv, which does not have as much in the way of interesting screenshots. And so instead, I'm just using this screenshot from an old TV ad. Evidently, in like the 1980s, you could just literally put up a screen that said exciting things are happening, and people would not, I guess, laugh that out of the room. I'm putting into the Zoom chat a link to a bit of a case study that I wrote that I'm basically going to narrate to you now about how I was able to use nudging, prioritizing, and communicating to help the maintainers of Pipenv. So as of November 2018, there was a Pipenv release. There had been several up until that point. This is an open source project that is used to manage application dependencies for people who are using Python. And then there wasn't a release for a while. And around March 2020, a community member suggested, hey, since Pipenv hasn't had a release in a little while, maybe we should take it off such and such a list of recommended tools because it might be sort of unmaintained. I saw this and I knew the right internet relay chat channel to go into to say, hey, Dan, who was the most active or one of the most active maintainers of Pipenv at that moment. I said, hey, Dan, what's up with this? What do you need, right? Is there something blocking you from making that release? And he said, honestly, he just needed someone to keep him on track because he kept getting distracted and doing things that weren't going to be effective in helping make the release happen. He said, I just need someone to come ask me what I'm doing, and if it isn't the right thing, then yell at me. And I said, would you listen to such a person? He said, at first I would fight back, and then I would realize they were right, and I would listen to them. I said, oh, okay. So over the course of 3 months, I nudged him a little bit every few days in IRC. I helped him by writing the rough draft, the first draft of some of his larger communications, to the public mailing list. I helped update some of the GitHub issues, including updating or closing the "is Pipenv dead?" questions saying, no, it is not dead. Here is where we are trying birth. I helped him by, writing the first draft of checklists and things like that, right? This was the occasional IRC nudge plus a few video calls and some email. Like I said, overall, it was about 15 hours over 3 months, and during which time he had to fix various continuous integration issues with Azure and deal with bug after bug that had cropped up in certain upstreams and things like that. And then in May 2020, he put out the release. This is the impossible but true screenshot, also from one of these 80s TV commercials. These are fantastic. And then there was a release in June 2020, and then in August 2020, and then in November 2020. I mean, it's back on track, So let me share some lessons from that. One is that you can really do a lot with a little, right? It only took about 15 hours for me to do this, and that is infinitesimal compared to the value that's unlocked to the industry, to hobbyists, to academics, nonprofits, governments, and so on, all these different kinds of organizations that use a fairly popular Python application dependency utility. And second, if you have a good relationship with people who are maintaining a bit of software, you can be honest with each other, right? Dan could be honest with me. He had run into me before. We knew each other a little bit. So he could be vulnerable with me and say, this is what I need. He could share his needs. And so if you can get that kind of relationship just by being a known person who engages in good faith and is reliable, then you can honestly ask, and then you can fulfill that need, and you can complement what's missing. And so many times, the people who are leading these projects, they need a little bit of coaching, a little bit of cheerleading, a little bit of help with project management, a sidekick. Right? And if you can be that sidekick, it can actually be amazingly effective with not that much actual clock time spent on it. I never touched the Pipenv code aside from making a couple pull requests about the documentation, right? I have never been a Pipenv developer, and yet I expedited this release. And you can do that too. So now let's talk a little bit about how projects get stuck and unstuck. First, I'll share some principles that I often use when I'm thinking about open source, the tech industries, and this work of getting projects unstuck. One is that there is no one tech industry and there is no one open source community. Like a fruit packing company with an IT department, United Kingdom national government agency's developer team and a Silicon Valley machine learning startup have different attitudes towards open source investment, and a 30-year-old systems programming tool with millions of users has different opportunities, constraints, needs, compared to a 6-year-old library that's gluing a content management system to a social media platform, just for example. Second is that skills are fungible, right? That domain knowledge can be learned. Oh, sorry, first I'll talk about the fact that open source contributors as a population disproportionately want to write code. We have an easy time finding or being found by people who want to write features and fix bugs and integrating those people into our projects. We have a harder time attracting and integrating the work of and the people, managers, marketers, testers, systems administrators, writers, user experience researchers and designers, customer service experts, event planners, and grant proposal writers, and then working well with those people and retaining them as well. And most people who become open source project maintainers did not start out wanting to do maintenance work, right? They usually wanted to make a cool thing or solve their own needs or fill a gap that was bothering them or their peers. And then they generally had no training and often have no inclination regarding long-term product strategy, customer and upstream relationship building, budgeting, seeking funding, user experience work, and lots of other necessary disciplines in software leadership. That does not have to be a problem as long as folks with complementary skills or people who are learning or willing to learn those complementary skills can join in and co-lead these projects with people who got into it for, I want to make this thing reasons. Again, I want to talk about skills being fungible and so on. I think sometimes we run into an idea that, well, these are the two people who built this piece of software. So any major decision that has to happen, they have to be the ones to initiate it. And if they don't have time, if they're out of time, well, then that's it. There's nothing that can be done. That's just an immovable blocker. But actually, just as they were not born knowing those skills, right? Other people could learn those skills. Even the most complicated, hairiest code base could be learned by someone else. Especially if there were money available for that person to train up as an intern or as an apprentice or as a sort of lieutenant and support them while they're in that learning curve. And therefore, domain knowledge can be learned and credibility can be earned. I wasn't born knowing anything about Python packaging. And I earned that credibility over time, including earning credibility from things I've done in other environments, right? I worked on MediaWiki, and I learned a bunch of skills working in that environment. And then a lot of those skills were actually fungible to working on Python, working on Autoconf, and so on and so on. Skills are fungible, domain knowledge can be learned, credibility can be earned. And every open source project has a life cycle. Right? Sometimes the best choice for a project is to end it, and many open source projects end really through quiet attrition. The founders acknowledging reality years after it ought to be evident if they ever make a public statement. And far better for contributors and users is a planned and announced end of life. Giving users a heads up is respectful, and it frees them to figure out a new path, including maybe a fork under new management. And choosing to actively end a project frees contributors to move on to projects that can engage with their work and deliver it to users. Knowing that ending is an option can sort of free us to think about, all right, why should this project do it? And if it should, let's actually have some increased vitality, knowing that it's not just inertia, right? It's not just the lowest effort option, or ideally it's not, right? And come towards it with some more purpose. I think it would be great if there were more sunsetting consultants who you could hire who would help you, wind down a project in a way that was reasonable for you and your downstreams. That's just an idea in case someone wants to grab that. So that covers some of the premises that I usually work with. So now let's talk about 5 major areas where legacy projects get stuck. And I think of these as strategy, team, interface, workflow, and money. So we'll talk a little bit about each of those, what sort of like how it becomes stuck, and some questions and tasks. So with strategy, the main question is, why should this project exist? And based on that, what should we prioritize? How it could become stuck, like if a project started to solve one person's problem and now other people with other motivations co-lead it, they might not realize that they disagree about what's important and what's urgent. So this can lead to frustration when people have different standards for what features to work on, how fast to merge contributions, and what to deprecate and when. So in the sort of strategy umbrella, as I think of it, you also run into questions like, well, what work do we need to prioritize and how urgent is it? What is our goal? And should this project exist? Should we decommission it? Has the team actually agreed on these things? So a fundamental task regarding strategy is to assess the project's goals, health and environment and competition, and check whether the team is agreed about what's important. Let me give you an example. When I was working on the overhaul of the Python package index, we were really this was a huge next generation rewrite. The old version of this web application had OpenID login. In order for us to get closer and closer to putting up the new site as production and decommissioning the old one, we had to make some hard choices about what is complete, right? Are we going to be feature for feature at parity with the old version? And one of the things that we cut was OpenID login, right? Because we decided that's not core to our mission. That was a difficult decision, right? There were people who loved OpenID login, but we had to make some in order to actually deploy on budget. Next, let's talk about team. The main question here is who maintains this project and what do they need? So how could this get stuck? Here's one scenario. Let's say one team member is so hard to negotiate with, they block other people from coming on board or implementing important improvements. Please feel free to just sort of say nod or mm-hmm in the chat if you've maybe run into a situation like that. Or maybe conversations about big architectural changes drag on for a long time, maybe even years, because people aren't sure what the decision criteria are or who will make that final decision. And some other questions might be, do we have enough maintainers to do the essential work? And do we have up-and-coming contributors who can replace us as maintainers in the future? Does everyone know who has what powers? Or are some people confused about who has the power to do certain things? Do we run into team workflow problems when different groups want to participate at different speeds? Is there maybe a difficult team member who needs handling? And do we have the social processes that we need to support the project and each other, like meetings, mentorship programs, and requests for comment? So the task here is to understand who does what, resolve confusion and conflict, and set up ways to prevent future confusion and conflict. Let me give you an example. When I was at the Wikimedia Foundation, we sometimes dealt with questions about, shall we make such and such a big change to the architecture, that were bigger than could be reasonably handled in an individual patch review process. But if we did it over email to make sure lots of people could take part and take a look at it, that didn't really have a built-in drive to completion. So we created a process for requests for comments, which involved a meeting every couple of weeks with some key people, so that we could have a process, right, a lightweight process for people to shepherd these proposals for major changes in such a way that they wouldn't just get left hanging and fall through the cracks. What I call interface is the question, who are our users and partners and potential contributors, and what do they need? So for instance, this can become stuck if the team doesn't consistently listen to and communicate with groups that they're working for and with, then they're likely to miss important information and make the wrong decisions and lose usage and trust. So some questions here would include, who are our partners and upstreams? Do new contributors fall through the cracks? Are we listening to them? Are we responding quickly enough to their concerns? Do they have a way of listening to us, like an announcement email list? Do we talk to each other? So a task here would be to identify the main stakeholders and actors and make it easier for the team to listen to and talk with them about their goals, expectations, and needs. So for example, when I was at the Wikimedia Foundation, one thing that we had difficulty with was, all right, Wikimedia maintained the main MediaWiki installation, right, that Wikipedia ran on. And yes, we always got those words mixed up once in a while. But MediaWiki itself is a bit of software that a tremendous number of people use standalone, right? They install their own wikis, and there were consultants and vendors and so on who provided MediaWiki support services. But we didn't have a good way of talking to those people because they're stakeholders in the MediaWiki product itself. And so I actually worked with an intern via the Outreachy internship program, who basically, her project was find the third-party users, talk with them, and sort of like gather them together so that we could talk to them in one place. And that started an initiative that is now continuing in a different form, where MediaWiki vendors and consultants can sort of have their voices heard in a group. Next, I want to talk about workflow, which is like digital workflow. Are the tools set up to support our work? So for instance, let's say contributors started the project on an old platform that doesn't really integrate conversation, patches, and review together, and no one's put in the effort to integrate them or migrate to a platform where those things are connected, so things fall through the cracks. Or people have started multiple discussion venues, and it's really tiresome to duplicate and interlink engineering discussions among them. So some questions related to this might be, do we run automated tests on every patch? Do new issues, patches, and discussions get interlinked so that developers and users can easily follow up? Are there bottlenecks or duplications in the platforms that we use to respond to issues, review code, and discuss this project in general? So a task here would be assess developer, contributor, and maintainer experience, and upgrade the tools and platforms to reduce toil for everyone. You heard what I said about Autoconf earlier in today's talk. And after working on the 2.70 release, Zach wrote up an assessment of not just Autoconf, but the entire GNU Auto Tools build system, and was able to say, look, here is how the fact that we don't have continuous integration is hurting us. Yeah, I see someone mentioning toil is an awesome word. Yeah, I think we're seeing more from the DevOps movement, right? And software reliability engineers, SREs, the idea that when you can reduce the kind of labor that is tedious and that computers are better at doing than humans, right? That's such a win, like expanding human capability. Finally, I want to talk about money, because money can help, right? You look at what happened with Autoconf, for instance, and what's happened with a number of other projects that I've worked on, sometimes as a volunteer, sometimes paid. It's a good thing to ask, do we have the necessary plans and income, or plans to get income, to make project progress? So this can become stuck because, let's say, a team is used to working all volunteer and hasn't imagined what chunks of work could be done by hiring new contractors, or the existing team doesn't have connections to the open source program officers at funding agencies, or the open source program officers at corporations, and funding officers at grant giving program and benefactors and so on. So questions here would include, do we have enough money to do what we want to do? Have we developed plans or proposals to turn money into progress? Can we persuade funders to give us money? And so a task here, again, this is something that you don't have to be a lead developer to do. Sometimes it's even better if you come in with learner's mind, right? And you're not already sort of in a rut of, well, this is the way we do things. The task here can be assess the current budget and roadmap, research possible funders, and propose and execute funded work. I'm going to share something from the Python world, and I'd love for people to tell me during Q&A whether this is something that could possibly is already doing really well in Perl, or maybe it could be done better. But there is a working group, a volunteer working group under the Python Software Foundation called Project Funding Working Group, which just tries to collect information about funding opportunities that are available for software projects that need some extra funding, whether these are grants or sponsorships or whatever. And when it comes to very large ideas of things that could take, could really benefit, like the heart of Python, can work with the development, the sort of fundraising person at the foundation to write and submit these proposals to the big grant agencies, if that's possible, if that's necessary. So I've just shared a link in Zoom for that. So now I want to talk about the sequence. Now, I want to be brief about this, but I'm going to go into more detail on this in a book that I'm writing And so I'm happy to talk with people outside of this to share like some draft chapters and things like that. But I think the way you set yourself up for success is to follow the sequence of settling. I'm assuming here that you're not already a maintainer of this project, right? This is all, you care about a project, you're Frodo, like how do you get in there and how do you make change? You settle in, you take charge, you make change, and you pass the baton. So settling in is doing routine tasks that do not require much trust so that you can assess things and earn credibility. You're taking initial project audit or inventory, and you're taking on routine responsibilities. You're learning the people. You're informally conversing with the people who brought you in. You're understanding conversation platforms and expectations. You're building trust. You're mapping the project's position and velocity. You're placing the project in context, and you're maybe conducting some kind of analysis, like a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis. Next, you're taking charge, which means you're doing things that require trust, but that the group has already agreed needs to happen. There's already consensus for this. This might be things like release communication and issue management, setting priorities, making releases, replying to issues that require some diplomacy, running meetings, dealing with existing budget, just getting your head around what is, if we have an existing budget, what is it? Noticing and dealing with people issues among your existing team. So this would be growing and promoting promising contributors, working really well with people. Maybe there are neuroatypical contributors who haven't been allowed to blossom fully because they haven't had accommodations. Helping maybe colleagues who are less reliable understand how they can get more reliable, coaching and excluding malicious or negligent people, understanding and dealing with people who are actually in the midst of trying to do a power grab. And I would also say that managing rhythm mismatches, what I call cadence shear in participation, also goes in this, when different people or different groups of people want to participate at very, very different speeds. And another thing that you can do at this stage is you can help guide new contributors who need guidance, including teaching and including unskilled volunteers, which is actually, you know, there are ways too when people are not particularly skilled in the domain of software engineering and want to contribute, there are ways to work with them in a way that's complementary for everyone. And then once you actually have more, you know, now let's say that you are one of the maintainership team, or at least something of a trusted advisor, you can start to make change, which means modifying and adding infrastructure that helps everybody do their work better. And infrastructure to me isn't just, you know, servers and bridges and things like that. It's the undergirdings, right, that allow us to do our work. So social infrastructure can help address team and interface issues. For instance, using and improving your use of mentorship programs like Google Summer of Code and Outreachy, finding ways to use in-person time well, maybe, or, you know, I should say synchronous time well. Helping this team with responsibility audits, checking, okay, what is it you have on your plate? And is it too much? And should we take something else? Adding and improving codes of conduct, dealing with governance and related changes, maybe developing a request for comment process, improving user and stakeholder communication and listening channels, adding user experience and product management activities. And along the way, using those to feed into changes that influence people in order to get the strategy section right unstuck. This is the long-term way that you make sure that on a consistent basis, you actually have an ongoing and living strategy. Digital infrastructure is, you know, increasing work capacity. I'm not really talking so much about improving the core code base of the project. I'm talking about all the stuff that makes the project possible, all of the platforms and processes you use to work on the code and related artifacts. So this is gathering and unifying platforms, kind of like what I did with WisCon, improving bug tracking and other user support interfaces, improving code review and related processes, automating workflow testing, documentation with continuous integration and bots, kind of like what Zach and I will be working on, continuing to work on for Autoconf. Financial infrastructure. So this is how to start thinking about budgets and money, writing grant and other funding proposals, and considering crowdfunding, tide lift, drip funding, and things like that. And legal infrastructure might come up, right? Maybe getting a legal organizational home, dealing with questions about licenses and trademarks sometimes is relevant. And finally, part of sustainability means the ability to leave. Sustainability, you're going to need to assess the sustainability of a project so that you can try and make it more resilient. And then leaving includes, finding your successors, saying no, responsibly stepping away, including realizing when to do so. This is all part of that life cycle, right? Almost certainly you will have other responsibilities that come up in your life. You want to be able to put stuff down so you can take up new stuff. And in my opinion, you sort of have to do it this way in terms of, you have to, if you're not already a maintainer, right, then you got to think, well, if you were the maintainer of a project and somebody came maybe with a bunch of bright ideas and a lot of enthusiasm, you want to, you're careful, right? You think, imagine handing the keys over to someone else, right? So, and that's why when you're going through this process, it's really helpful if you can demonstrate that power for the sake of power is not your goal, right? That you want basically what everybody wants, what everybody on their best days wants, right? They want to serve the users and to make a good, robust thing, right? So when people have conversations, when issues come up, arguments come up about engineering questions of architecture, code style, which platform to use, it can be really helpful if your main opinion is, well, this is blocking us, so I want to facilitate us getting this resolved. And you're not that attached to any one answer so much as, well, let's get this resolved so we can move forward. Of course, if questions come up that have to do with your core values, then of course you need to stand up and be authentic, right? But if your main concern really isn't, do we use this dependency versus that dependency, it can be really helpful if you keep your eye on the prize of what it is that you really care about and focus on that in how you interact with other people and the communications that you make. That is, in my opinion, some wisdom that I've learned over the past several years about how to get open source projects unstuck, how they get stuck, what some of the core issues are, how we get them unstuck. And so I'd love for you to join me. I am working, as I say, on a book. I think these tools and practices, and I hope this book will help so that not just lead developers and founders, but anyone can be Frodo. I'm working on this book. I do not know when it will come out. I'm talking with publishers now, but you can get right now a free 38-page sampler of some of the early chapters in case you want to grab that. So I've just put a link in the chat here. I'd love to know what you think of that. If you'd like to know some of the other stuff that I'm writing. A lot of the stuff that I've talked about in today's talk, I'm going to try and write more in detail with okay, here's how you do this step. Here's how you do this step in the book. So please contact me with ideas, experiences, and thoughts. I am at changeset.nyc. So that is it for my prepared material. I think since we started a few minutes late, we probably have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions. Is that right, Todd?
That's correct.
Fantastic. All right. I don't think I see whether anyone is using the hand up functionality in Zoom to ask a question. I don't quite know how people have been doing that here with the Perl conference. So since I think no one has asked a question yet, if you have a question, I think you could go ahead and just say it.
I have a question. This is Brett Estrad. So you're here, and you're obviously familiar with open source, and I presume to some degree the Perl community. Have in your time, I guess, observing us in the wild and here and whatnot, are there any areas in which you think that we need to improve things or processes? Because there's certainly a number of things that you could say are I would say are stuck, and probably most would agree. But are there things that you see as stuck within the Perl community, and do you have suggestions or some paths forward to help us out?
I want to back off and say I am a little bit familiar with the Perl community. I forgot to mention that the WisCon application that I worked on back in 2011, for instance, is written in Perl. I use Dreamwidth, which is a Perl project. I use and interact with some Perl projects, but certainly the majority of my work for the past several years has been in PHP, Python, C, and so on. But so I want to say I certainly don't have the familiarity with the sort of broad scope of different Perl open source projects, like large and small, in different domains and topic areas that I'm sure a number of you have. That being said, I think that if I could be wrong, but I think that an area where, in general, Perl open source projects and the Perl ecology as a whole could improve is with the team aspect of the 5 Stucknesses that I mentioned, and in particular, on having a really good engagement funnel for attracting new contributors, bringing them in, and retaining them for projects. And I'd love to know, if you think I'm wrong, please let me know. If you think, what, actually Perl and Perl projects are really strong at that, please tell me. But I think that's the sense that I get, is a general, there is a willingness among Perl open source projects in general. There is a willingness, like, hey, yeah, if someone came by and wanted to learn, we would teach them. But engagement in a more systematic way is maybe a little, and making sure that there's like attention to retention, I think might be a little bit more lacking. That's currently my thought.
Okay, thank you. And I don't agree or disagree with you. I think
I hear you.
Hearing your opinion with fresh eyes is valuable. So anyway, thank you for the answer.
Thank you. Yeah, as I want to say, like, other people who have a much broader view, if you have a different view, you're probably right.
Jim Keenan has a question.
More of a comment than a question.
But I'd rather wait. I'd like to get questions first. Thanks.
Okay, very quick question from me then. You were talking about the Python process. We have a grants committee process where it's essentially passive. You say, send us your grant request and we'll evaluate it and vote on it. The Python process, is that more active, where they go and beat the bushes trying to find places where money would be helpful?
So I want to clarify. I'm really sorry that I was unclear about this, because I totally get what you're saying. So the Perl Foundation and the Python Software Foundation, as well as I think the Ruby, a similar organization with Ruby, and a number of other organizations for other languages and frameworks, directly give out grants. That is something the Perl Foundation does, and it's something PSF does. And I think probably both Perl and Python Software Foundations, do some amount of publicity, right, and outreach around that grants process. There's also, in addition to that, in the Python world, there is this additional thing called this project funding working group, which is trying to collect information about other funders that are interested in funding open source work, and then doing some amount of outreach to try to connect that with projects that might not have the kind of need where the PSF grant would be a good fit, but maybe one of these other grants would be a good fit. So for instance, the Mozilla open source software or open technology fund opportunities would be examples of projects where this other working group would be sort of more involved in helping people think about that and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Great.
I think it worked out that Jim either had to say his comment or go, but hopefully he'll be good about sending it to you as part of the feedback.
I hope I didn't come off as too harsh. I just wanted to make room for questions.
I think he wouldn't have taken it harshly. It's something I haven't seen before, and I as a speaker, I heard you do it, and I said, oh, maybe sometime I should do that.
Well, then make it easier when people are saying, this is more a comment than a question. They're sort of prefacing it. It's like a good handshake, kind of, they're declaring their metadata, you know? Does anyone else have a question that they'd like to share?
All right, we're at 6 minutes till, and I think they'll need the channel, so.
Yeah. All right, thank you everyone so much. So I have a question. When do you come to FOSDEM? I'm not sure when I'll come again. I have been in the past. I'd like to come again when travel's easier and everything. And I'm getting a clap, 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 which is wonderful. And someone asks about connecting PDL with NumFocus and trying to see if there's anything. NumFocus does have a public email address in case that's helpful. All right, I guess that's it for today. I really appreciate getting the chance to talk to you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you.